Samuel Hart stepped out of a yellow cab in front of the Grand Regent Hotel, his old cowboy hat shadowing his weathered face as he carried a single brown leather suitcase. The doorman noticed him but did not move, their polished uniforms and stiff posture broadcasting indifference to the man who looked like he had stepped out of another world. Guests in suits cut in Milan and dresses stitched in Paris glided across the marble entrance, their luggage shining with the logos of designers that Samuel had never needed to know. Inside, the lobby gleamed with opulence, crystal chandeliers raining golden light over marble floors and a mahogany desk where 3 receptionists performed their practiced smiles. Samuel moved with the ease of a man who had walked into countless rooms where people expected little of him, and his calm steps carried the kind of dignity that silence often holds. Carly, the youngest receptionist, caught sight of him, and her professional smile faltered, replaced by an awkward glance toward her colleagues, as if she sensed the coming storm. The second clerk lowered his eyes and buried himself in papers that no one had asked him to read, creating the illusion of busyness to avoid the stranger at the counter. Then Michael Graves emerged from his glass-walled office, the grey-tailored suit hugging his frame, his hair slicked back with precision, his walk radiating an arrogance that was rehearsed. Michael prided himself on spotting who belonged in his hotel and who did not, and with a single glance he had already written Samuel into a story of mediocrity and exclusion. "Good afternoon," Samuel said, tipping his hat with the slow courtesy of another era. "I'd like a room for 3 nights. Michael's smile spread thin, never touching his eyes, and his reply was laced with the venom of superiority. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" The word "sir" delivered as if it were a cruel joke. "No reservation," Samuel answered steadily. "Came straight from Texas. Thought I could book here directly." A woman carrying a pearl-studded clutch paused to whisper something sharp into her husband's ear, her eyes lingering on Samuel with an amused disdain. A businessman in a navy suit put his phone down, sensing the unusual drama unfolding near the front desk. Michael tapped on the computer with theatrical slowness, each keystroke a hammer building a wall meant to keep Samuel out. "Our rooms," he said with a deliberate pause, "are very specific, and at the moment we only have suites available, $800 per night." The number was pronounced like a death sentence, meant to humiliate, meant to draw chuckles from the silent audience, now gathering with their eyes. Samuel nodded with the calm of a man who had nothing to prove and everything already in hand. "That's fine. Book me for 3 nights. He said, his voice unshaken. Michael's smirk twitched for the briefest of seconds, disbelief cracking through the mask before arrogance returned to his posture. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the mahogany desk like a predator closing in on prey. "You do understand we need guarantees, don't you?" he said loudly, ensuring every pair of ears in the lobby would drink his cruelty. "Our guests are people of a certain standard, people of wealth, refinement, pedigree." His words cut through the air like knives, drawing silence, drawing stares, drawing the discomfort of those who suddenly found themselves witnesses to something ugly. Michael sensed his audience and pressed the blade deeper. "Tell you what, cowboy," he said with a smirk that oozed condescension, "if you can pay for the cheapest room up front, I'll give you the suite for free." The words dropped into the lobby like dynamite, and the air shifted instantly. A wealthy woman gasped, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. 2 executives waiting for their driver exchanged glances of discomfort, silently condemning the unnecessary cruelty. Even Carly, standing stiff behind the desk, lowered her eyes in embarrassment for the man her boss had chosen to target. Michael expected laughter, expected nods of approval, expected applause for his wit, but what came instead was a wave of silence heavy with disapproval. Samuel S. gaze met Michael S. with the calmness of a man who had endured storms that would drown others, and that calm unnerved the arrogant manager. "What's the rate for your cheapest room?" Samuel asked quietly, every word firm and measured. Michael chuckled, a hollow, cruel sound that scraped against the polished walls of the lobby. $800, he said, dripping venom into every syllable. Samuel adjusted his hat with a small motion and answered with the serenity of someone who already knew the end of the story. "Very well. I accept the wager." Michael blinked, his face caught between disbelief and rising irritation. "You accept?" he asked, voice cracking in a pitch too high for his intended control. "Yes, if I pay $800 up front, you give me the suite, correct?" Samuel repeated calmly. The silence deepened until it seemed the entire hotel breathed with anticipation of the next move. "What do you think you're doing?" Michael asked sharply, his tone beginning to crack under the pressure of the silence around him. "Organizing my documents," Samuel replied as he sat down, his voice steady, his body language carrying the weight of someone entirely at home in the storm. He unzipped the suitcase, and the sound sliced through the silence like the opening act of a duel. Inside, everything was arranged with the precision of a man who respected order. Clothes neatly folded, papers stacked, an old envelope resting on top. Michael's eyes narrowed, curiosity betraying the arrogance he worked so hard to maintain. Samuel pulled out the envelope, unhurried, and began counting bills with the deliberate rhythm of a man who had done so many times before. "My God, he's counting cash," whispered a woman near the velvet chairs, her words traveling through the crowd like wildfire. Heads turned, conversations froze, and phones discreetly lifted to capture the scene that now belonged more to a movie than to a lobby. Michael's chest tightened, sweat creeping beneath his perfect suit, but he raised his voice, desperate to claw back control. "Cash isn't enough. We need identification, documentation, proof of income," he declared loudly, his tone betraying a crack of desperation. Samuel looked up, and for the first time since his arrival, a gentle smile curved his lips, the kind of smile that fathers give to impatient sons. "Don't worry, young man. I have everything right here." The word young sliced through Michael's pride, shrinking him in front of an audience he no longer controlled. Samuel rose slowly, the envelope of cash in one hand, his old wallet in the other, walking toward the desk with footsteps that echoed like tolling bells. He placed the stack of bills on the mahogany counter, each note crisp and precise, his calm voice carrying across the silent lobby. $800 counted exactly. Murmurs erupted instantly, the tension snapping into audible shock, disbelief, and awe. Michael stared at the money as though it were a venomous snake ready to strike. His hands trembled when he leaned closer, his arrogance slipping from him like water escaping cupped hands. That's really $800, he muttered, his voice thinner than he intended. "Exactly," Samuel repeated, sliding his ID across the counter. Michael read it. Samuel Hart, age 55, Texas rancher. The name ordinary, but the moment extraordinary. Carly leaned forward, eyes wide, her professionalism battling with the curiosity she could no longer contain. The other employees edged closer, their interest stronger than the pretense of work. Michael Ennis' throat tightened as he forced out a question meant to save what remained of his pride. "Where did this money come from?" he asked, his voice cutting harshly. "It's honest money, earned with the work of my hands," Samuel replied simply, his words heavy with unshakable truth. "What kind of work?" Michael pressed, hoping to trap him, hoping for weakness. "I'm a cattle rancher," Samuel said with the same tone one might use to describe the color of the sky. A few guests chuckled quietly, the word conjuring images of dust and small-town simplicity, easy prey for Michael's arrogance. Michael smirked, seizing what he thought was victory. A rancher, staying at the Grand Regent, he scoffed, his voice dripping with disbelief. Samuel's calm remained unbroken as he replied, "I'm here for the livestock auction tomorrow." Michael's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering across his face. "And how much do you plan to spend at this auction?" he asked, stretching the last word as though it were filth. "Depends on the animals," Samuel answered evenly. "But I brought enough for a few good sires." "And how much could one possibly cost?" Michael demanded, his voice sharpening with ridicule. Samuel paused only long enough to let the silence grow heavy, then spoke, "From hundreds of thousands to several $1 million, depending on the bloodline." The words detonated in the lobby like a thunderclap, leaving mouths open, phones lowered, eyes fixed on the man they had underestimated. Michael burst into forced laughter, desperate, hollow, brittle. "You want me to believe a bull cost millions?" he sneered, his voice cracking despite his effort. Samuel met his eyes, his calm stronger now than ever, and replied, "I don't need you to believe anything. I only need you to honor your word." The crowd held its breath, the silence so thick it seemed the marble itself was waiting for what came next. The bills lay on the counter like a silent verdict, $800 in crisp notes that turned the air electric. Michael stared at them, his hand hovering above the stack as though touching it might burn away the last threads of his pride. Around him, the lobby had gone quiet, the murmurs replaced by the collective weight of judgment hanging from every guest and employee present. Samuel waited, his face calm, his hat resting in his hand, his posture carrying the unshaken authority of a man who had endured storms without bending. "Where did this come from?" Michael asked again, but the words were hollow, the voice of a man no longer in command. "From the sweat of my work," Samuel said. "The land provides if you respect it." Michael smirked weakly, searching for ridicule in the simplest truth, clinging to arrogance like a drowning man to driftwood. "Work, right? What kind of work pays you in piles of cash like this?" "Ranching," Samuel answered, unshaken. "Raising cattle, breeding, building bloodlines that carry value beyond what most city men imagine." The words triggered quiet laughter from a corner of the lobby, a couple shaking their heads as though the idea of million-dollar cattle belonged in fairy tales. Michael seized the reaction like a gift, straightening his posture with the arrogance that had already begun to crack. "So you're telling me you came here, by cab, dressed like that, to buy bulls worth millions?" "I'm not telling you anything you need to believe," Samuel said evenly. "I'm only reminding you of the promise you made." Michael's smirk faltered, the edges of his confidence fraying in front of a crowd that had grown less amused and more unsettled. The silence returned, thicker now, pressing down on the manager like the marble walls themselves had turned against him. Samuel lifted his phone, an old device worn from years of use, its screen faintly cracked but reliable, and asked politely, "May I place a call?" "To whom?" Michael demanded, suspicion dripping from the words. "My accountant," Samuel replied, his tone casual, his calmness unsettling the man across the desk. Michael laughed, brittle and desperate. "Fine, call whoever you want. When the story falls apart, you'll be escorted out." Samuel dialed and pressed the speaker, the ring echoing through the heavy silence until a professional voice answered, "Good afternoon, Mr. Hart." "Afternoon, Robert," Samuel said, his voice steady, his eyes fixed calmly on Michael. "Remind me, what's the budget we set aside for tomorrow's auction?" The accountant's voice came through crisp and respectful. "We prepared a substantial reserve, as you requested, to cover high-value sires without limitation." Gasps rippled across the lobby, the respect in the accountant's voice undeniable, the weight of his words pressing Michael further into the corner. Samuel nodded slightly, "And we'll pay as usual, through transfer or the corporate card if needed." "Correct," Robert confirmed. "You also have immediate liquidity in case sellers require fast settlement." "Thank you, Robert," Samuel said, ending the call as quietly as he had begun it. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the quick breaths of Michael struggling to contain his panic. "That proves nothing," he stammered. "Anyone could pretend to be an accountant. A phone call doesn't mean you're worth millions." The guests shifted uncomfortably, a wealthy woman shaking her head in disbelief at the manager's stubborn cruelty. Samuel smiled again, the same gentle, fatherly expression that disarmed arrogance like wind extinguishing a candle. "Words can be doubted," Samuel said, "but numbers cannot." He returned to his suitcase, pulling out a black leather folder aged by years of careful handling, and placed it on the counter. Michael hesitated before opening it, his trembling fingers betraying the fear he had worked so hard to conceal. Inside were bank statements, balances in the millions, transfers larger than most salaries earned in a lifetime, each figure a nail sealing the coffin of his arrogance. Michael's eyes darted desperately across the numbers, his lips moving soundlessly as though reading them might change their truth. "These could be forged," he whispered, but the whisper carried no conviction, and the crowd around him stirred in disapproval. "Call the bank," Samuel offered calmly. "My manager there knows me by name." Michael swallowed hard, his throat dry, his pride collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof. Just then, the revolving doors opened, and a distinguished couple stepped inside, their arrival halting the atmosphere like the entrance of royalty into a courtroom. The man wore an Italian suit, cut with authority, his wife in a gown that caught the chandelier light like water-catching sun. Michael forced a smile, relief flashing across his face as he recognized one of his most esteemed guests. "Dr. Lawson, what a pleasure," he said, trying to salvage dignity from the wreckage of his pride. But Dr. Henry Lawson did not return the smile, his eyes drawn instead to Samuel Hart standing by the counter. "Samuel!" Henry exclaimed, his voice warm, his surprise genuine. "Samuel Hart, I'll be damned, it's been too long." The lobby gasped collectively, the sudden familiarity piercing through every doubt, every sneer, every whisper of disbelief. Samuel turned, his calm face breaking into a genuine smile, and the two men clasped hands with the warmth of old friends. "Henry Lawson," Samuel said. "Still raising those Arabian horses, I imagine?" "Always," Henry replied with a proud grin. "And I've got a colt that might interest you, son of Al-Rashid himself." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, names of bloodlines, values, and deals traded like common words between men who lived in worlds most could not afford to imagine. Every sentence was another dagger into Michael's pride, every word proving how disastrously he had misjudged the man in front of him. "Samuel," Henry asked with a curious smile, "are you here for the Chicago auction?" "That's right," Samuel said. "Thought I'd see what this city has to offer before heading back." "You know," Henry said, turning toward Michael now, his tone sharpening, "I hope this hotel has treated you with the respect you deserve." Michael's throat closed, words refusing to form as he stammered incoherently. "Respect," Samuel said gently, "is a lesson best taught by example." But Henry's voice carried the weight of thunder as he faced the manager. "Do you know who this man is, Michael?" Michael shook his head faintly, his eyes down, his confidence shattered. "This is Samuel Hart," Henry declared, his voice filling the lobby, "owner of Heartland Ranch, one of the most respected cattle operations in the country." A wave of murmurs erupted instantly, names recognized, articles recalled, phones pulled discreetly from pockets to confirm what they had just heard. "Heartland," whispered a woman. "Isn't that the ranch that sells genetics overseas? Exports to half a dozen countries," her husband replied, his voice laced with awe. Michael stumbled back, his hands gripping the counter for support, as if the marble itself might keep him standing. But Samuel had not finished, his calm presence carrying the weight of another revelation. He returned to his suitcase once more, this time pulling out a worn brown folder marked with official seals. "I should have done this sooner," Samuel said. "Let me make something clear. He laid the document on the counter, sliding it toward Michael with a steady hand. "Read it," Samuel said gently, "out loud so everyone can hear." Michael lifted the paper with trembling fingers, but his eyes faltered, his lips unable to form the words. Henry took it from his hands, adjusted his glasses, and began to read aloud. "Certificate of ownership," Henry said, pausing for effect, "registered to Samuel Hart." The lobby leaned forward collectively, the silence charged with anticipation. Property: the Grand Regent Hotel, including all adjacent land, Michigan Avenue, Chicago. The explosion was immediate, gasps breaking into shouts of disbelief, hands covering mouths, eyes widening in shock. "He owns the hotel," a guest cried out. "This whole place is his." Michael staggered back as though struck, his face drained of blood, his body trembling under the collapse of everything he thought he controlled. 3 years ago, Samuel said calmly, "I bought this property when the previous group was failing. It seemed a worthy investment." The reality settled over the lobby like a storm breaking, every eye turning to Michael, the man who had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating his employer. Samuel's calm eyes locked on him, unblinking, heavy with the weight of quiet judgment. "For 3 years, I've received reports of this hotel's excellent service," Samuel said softly, "reports signed with your name." Michael's legs buckled, his mind racing through every fabricated document, every flattering lie he had fed upward, now collapsing under the truth. "Reports filled with praise," Samuel continued, "yet today I witnessed the truth." The crowd stood in silence, every guest, every clerk, every cleaner frozen by the gravity of the moment. Samuel stepped slowly around the counter, his boots clicking against marble, each sound a countdown to Michael's fate. He stopped in front of the trembling man, his voice steady but heavy with finality. 3 years ago, when I purchased this hotel, I had a vision," Samuel said, "a place where every guest, regardless of appearance, would be treated with dignity." Michael closed his eyes, the weight of his own arrogance crushing him, the truth undeniable, the humiliation complete. "You did not just disrespect me as a customer," Samuel continued. "You disrespected the very values this place was meant to stand for." Michael opened his mouth, but no words came, only a desperate whisper caught in his throat. Samuel's eyes softened, but his words were firm. "A man can recover from mistakes, Michael, but only if he learns humility." The lobby waited in absolute silence, the world holding its breath to hear whether Samuel would deliver punishment or mercy. The silence in the lobby was no longer simply quiet, it was sacred, as though the marble hall had turned into a courtroom and Samuel Hart into its judge. Michael stood frozen behind the counter, his once flawless suit damp with sweat, his hands trembling against the polished wood as though it might keep him upright. Samuel's calm gaze did not waver, the weight of his silence pressing harder than any shouted anger could have. "Michael," Samuel began, his voice steady and low, "when I bought this hotel, I did so with the vision that it would be a place of welcome." His words rolled through the air like a tide, quiet but powerful, impossible to escape. A place where appearance would not dictate worth, where dignity would be given freely, as it should be to every human being. Michael swallowed hard, his lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came, the weight of his shame pinning his voice. Samuel stepped closer, his boots sounding deliberate against the marble floor, each step echoing like a countdown. "Today," he continued, "you showed me the truth of your leadership, and it is not the truth I was told in your reports." A murmur spread through the crowd, guests exchanging knowing looks, employees shrinking as though they too carried blame. Michael's knees trembled, his pride shattered, his mind racing with pleas he no longer had the courage to form. "You crafted reports filled with praise," Samuel said, "reports that boasted of fairness, of excellence, of respect for every guest." He paused, his eyes sharp but not cruel. the silence that followed more painful than the words themselves. But the reality I witnessed was arrogance, humiliation, and the kind of pride that poisons service. Michael lowered his head, unable to meet the gaze that seemed to pierce through every lie he had ever told. "I should fire you this very moment," Samuel said, his tone so calm that it chilled the room more than anger ever could. Gasps broke from a few corners of the lobby, the inevitability of the words hanging heavy, but Samuel lifted his hand gently, as if staying the execution. "And yet," he continued, "I believe every man deserves a chance to learn humility." Michael's head snapped up, hope flickering through eyes filled with shame. "You will not remain here," Samuel declared. "Not in this position, not with this responsibility." The words landed with finality, and Michael's shoulders slumped as though the very air had left him. "Instead, you will report to Heartland Ranch in Texas," Samuel said, "where you will begin again as an assistant, with pay to match the role." A wave of murmurs swept across the lobby, disbelief mixing with fascination at the unusual sentence. "There you will learn," Samuel continued, "what it means to work with honesty, what it means to respect others, what it means to serve rather than command." Michael nodded quickly, tears forming at the corners of his eyes, relief and humiliation crashing into him at once. "Yes, sir," he whispered, his voice broken. "I'll do it. I'll go. I'll learn." Samuel placed a firm but not unkind hand on his shoulder, steadying him as though anchoring a man lost at sea. "Humility is not weakness," Samuel said. "It is strength, the kind that keeps a man standing when arrogance has failed him." Michael lowered his head again, this time not in shame, but in the first spark of genuine humility. "Carly," Samuel said suddenly, his voice carrying across the counter, turning the eyes of the room to the young receptionist. She startled, her face flushing, her hands tightening nervously at her sides. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You showed respect today," Samuel said. "Even when your superior showed none, you maintained dignity, and that is what leadership looks like." Carly's mouth fell open, her breath catching as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. "From this moment," Samuel continued, "you will act as interim manager of this hotel." The lobby erupted in murmurs again, surprise crackling through the air like electricity. Carly gasped, her hand covering her mouth, disbelief written in her wide eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I'm ready for such responsibility." Samuel smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried reassurance, not flattery. "The fact that you doubt yourself," he said, "means you understand responsibility better than most." Carly nodded, tears pricking her eyes, her voice cracking as she whispered, "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." "I believe you will," Samuel said warmly, "and that belief is enough for me." He turned back to the stunned crowd, his presence commanding but never arrogant, his calm a lesson louder than any speech. "Let this be clear," Samuel announced. "In this hotel, every guest is equal, no matter the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the accent they carry." The words struck the lobby like thunder, drawing nods, drawing applause that began softly but grew. Dr. Lawson clapped first, his voice ringing out, "Now that is the mark of a true leader." The guests joined, their applause swelling until the lobby echoed with the sound of approval, admiration, and respect. Even the staff, the cleaners, the bellhops, the clerks, clapped with genuine relief, as though a burden had been lifted from the air. Michael lowered his head deeper, the applause not for him, but for the man who had stripped his pride and offered him redemption. At that moment, the revolving doors spun again, and a sharp figure entered, portfolio in hand, stride filled with purpose. Marcos Alvarez approached the counter, his eyes scanning the room, instantly sensing the unusual gravity of the scene. "Mr. Hart," Marcos said directly, I'm Marcos Alvarez from the auction house. We need to speak. Samuel extended his hand with familiarity. Marcos, good to see you. Is there a problem with tomorrow's event? Not a problem exactly, Marcos replied, opening his portfolio. But we've received early offers on several sires we know you'll want. The lobby grew silent again, every ear catching the words early offers and sires with disbelief. Offers, Samuel repeated, his brow furrowing. Above market. Well above, Marcos confirmed, several in the millions, and the sellers would prefer to negotiate with you directly before opening the floor. Michael collapsed into a nearby chair, his body no longer able to carry the weight of irony crushing him, hearing numbers beyond his imagination. Samuel nodded thoughtfully, his composure unbroken, as though discussing millions was as ordinary as discussing weather. I'll review them, he said, but I prefer to see the animals myself before committing. Marcos smiled, relieved by Samuel's steady response. Of course, I'll arrange transport for you in the morning. The crowd stood frozen, their world turned upside down by a rancher who had just revealed the scope of his empire. Thank you, Marcos, Samuel said. I'll be ready. Dr. Lawson chuckled, shaking his head in admiration. Samuel, you never stop surprising even those who know you best. Life is full of surprises, Samuel said calmly, some harsher than others, some needed more than wanted. His eyes flicked to Michael, whose pale face carried the mark of a man broken but perhaps not lost. You have a chance, Michael, Samuel said gently. Don't waste it. Michael nodded vigorously, tears streaming, his pride gone, his gratitude raw and unpolished. Yes, sir, he whispered. I will not waste it. Samuel turned back toward Carly, his expression softening. You'll do well, I have no doubt. Carly nodded again, still overwhelmed, her heart pounding at the trust placed in her. Use the $800, Samuel added, sliding the bills toward her, to train the staff, to ensure this lesson is never forgotten. Carly's eyes widened, her hand trembling as she accepted the money, her voice breaking. Yes, sir, it will be done. Samuel placed his hat back on his head, the gesture calm, final, filled with quiet authority. The lobby seemed to expand with the moment, the applause subsiding into reverent silence once more. Dr. Lawson leaned toward Samuel with a smile. Shall we head up, old friend? We've got plans for tomorrow's auction to discuss. We shall, Samuel said, lifting his suitcase with ease, the leather worn but strong, the symbol of a man who carried only what he needed. Marcos closed his portfolio, nodding with respect. I'll meet you in the morning with the files prepared. The three men, Samuel, Henry, and Marcos, moved toward the elevator, their steps slow, deliberate, the eyes of the crowd following in reverent silence. The elevator doors opened, golden light spilling from within, like the final stage of a performance. Samuel paused, his eyes sweeping once more across the lobby, across the guests, across the staff. He met Carly's gaze, her eyes wide with determination, her chin lifted with newfound strength. He met Michael's gaze too, the broken man clutching the hope of redemption like a lifeline. And he met the gaze of the guests, each one humbled by the lesson they had just witnessed. Remember, Samuel said softly, his words echoing across the marble. Respect costs nothing, but it builds everything. The elevator doors began to close, the moment sealing like the final scene of a film. The crowd stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking deeper than any lecture, deeper than any rulebook. Samuel's calm eyes disappeared behind the closing doors, leaving the lobby changed forever by what it had seen. And when the applause rose again, louder than before, it was not for wealth or power, but for the quiet greatness of a man who carried dignity like a crown. The elevator carried Samuel upward, but down in the lobby, the echoes of his words lingered like the fading chords of a symphony. Guests remained frozen for a long moment, staring at the space where the cowboy-hatted rancher had stood. Some whispered his name, testing the syllables like they were tasting history. Others pulled out their phones, searching for Samuel Hart Heartland Ranch, as though needing proof that the man was real. The staff exchanged glances, realizing their world had shifted, realizing the balance of power had changed before their eyes. Carly stood behind the counter, still trembling, her hand clutching the envelope of bills Samuel had placed in her care. She felt the weight of responsibility heavier than the money itself, a burden and an honor wrapped together. Michael remained slumped in the chair, pale, sweating, eyes downcast, his mind reeling from humiliation and from the lifeline Samuel had extended. The guests slowly began to stir, conversations resuming but never returning to what they had been before. "He owns the hotel," one man muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "He owns it all. And the manager humiliated him," his wife added, her voice sharp with judgment. Michael heard every word, each one another stone added to the weight pressing down on him. Carly cleared her throat, forcing her voice to steady as she addressed the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, please allow us to resume normal service." The words surprised even her, the authority in her tone catching in her own ears. The guests nodded, some offering faint smiles of approval, and slowly the atmosphere softened. Upstairs, Samuel entered the suite Michael had sworn he would never see, the irony settling like a quiet storm. The room was vast, lined with velvet drapes and glass walls that looked over the Chicago skyline, glittering against the night. "Samuel," he said, shaking his head, "only you could walk into a place like this and bring the whole room to its knees." "Anyone to their knees, Henry. I just reminded them what respect looks like." Samuel poured himself a glass of water, not whiskey, not champagne, and drank slowly, savoring the quiet. "I didn't come to Chicago to teach lessons," he said. "I came to buy cattle, and that's what I intend to do." "And you will," Marcos replied firmly, "but tonight you also changed lives, whether you wanted to or not." Henry leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You gave Michael something rare, Samuel, a second chance, when most men would have destroyed him." Samuel sighed, his eyes drifting toward the window, the city lights reflecting in them. "Anger is easy," he said softly. "Anyone can humiliate a man already broken, but offering him a road back, that takes more strength." "And humility," Henry added, nodding slowly, "something most men with your wealth wouldn't bother with." Samuel set the glass down, his face calm. "Wealth doesn't measure a man, Henry. It only tests him." Marcos opened his portfolio, spreading documents across the glass table. The files detailed bloodlines, charts of lineage stretching back decades, photographs of animals that looked more like kings than cattle. "These sires," Marcos explained, "are drawing international attention, and the offers on the table already exceed records." Samuel studied the papers with the focus of a surgeon, his finger tracing bloodlines, his eyes narrowing with calculation. "This one," he said, tapping a photograph, "this is worth watching. His grandsire was a legend." "Already an offer of 2 million, Marcos confirmed, "but the seller will hold for more if you step in." Henry whistled softly, leaning back. 2 million for one animal, and people laughed when you mentioned it downstairs." Samuel smiled faintly. "People laugh at what they don't understand, Henry. They always have." Marcos flipped to another file. "This bull carries Brazilian genetics, strong resistance, heavy frame, the kind you value." "And the bidding will be fierce," Samuel predicted, "but only if his temperament matches his frame." Marcos nodded, impressed at the precision of Samuel's instincts. "I'll make sure you get to see him before the floor opens." The three men continued. Papers spread, voices low but sharp, the weight of millions sitting casually between them. Downstairs, Carly walked the lobby with new authority, her eyes sharper, her voice firmer, her presence growing with every step. The staff followed her lead, almost instinctively, as though they had been waiting for someone to show them what respect looked like. Guests who earlier smirked at Samuel now spoke in hushed tones of admiration, recounting the story as though they had witnessed history. Michael remained in the corner, his suit rumpled, his face pale, his mind drowning in shame. But in the pit of that shame, a small seed had been planted, a chance for redemption Samuel had forced him to accept. Texas, he whispered to himself. A ranch, hard work. Maybe that's where I'll find myself again. His pride had been stripped away, but in its place there was something else, fragile but real. Humility. Carly approached him cautiously, her eyes kind but her voice steady. You'll be all right, Michael, if you listen and learn. He looked up at her, surprised at the authority in her tone, realizing how quickly the power had shifted. I'll try, he said quietly. God knows I'll try. Upstairs, Samuel folded the last document, his decision made, his mind steady as stone. Tomorrow, he said, we'll go to the auction and we'll see who has the courage to stand. Samuel lifted his own, the faintest smile touching his lips. The men clinked glasses softly. No applause, no cheers, just the quiet sound of agreement stronger than any contract. The night deepened outside, the city glowing below like a sea of fireflies caught in glass. Samuel stood at the window, his reflection blending with the skyline, a man of the land standing in the heart of steel and glass. This city tests men differently, he murmured, but the test is always the same, pride or humility. Behind him, Henry and Marcos exchanged a glance, both realizing that Samuel was more than just a rancher. He was a force. Downstairs, Carly gathered the staff, her voice firm. From tonight forward, we treat every guest with dignity, no exceptions. The staff nodded, some ashamed, some relieved, all aware that change had come. The staff dispersed with renewed purpose, the marble lobby now carrying a new air, not of arrogance but of vigilance. Michael sat alone, still silent, still pale, but with the faint flicker of hope keeping him from collapse. Guests whispered his name, Samuel Hart, testing it like a secret password, telling each other they had seen something extraordinary. Some snapped photographs of the suite list, pointing to the top floor, proof that the cowboy owned the castle. Upstairs, Samuel sat at the desk, writing a short note with a pen older than the hotel itself. Respect costs nothing, but it builds everything. He folded the note and placed it in the suitcase, alongside papers, documents, and the envelope that had silenced a room. The suitcase closed with a soft snap, the sound like a chapter ending, but the story only beginning. Samuel leaned back in the chair, his body tired, his mind steady, his heart at peace. Tomorrow would bring noise, shouting, numbers, millions traded like chips at a table. But tonight was quiet, tonight was reflection, tonight was the stillness before the storm. Rest is for the weak, Samuel said with a faint smile, but I'll take a few hours. The suite door closed behind him, leaving Samuel and Henry in the hush of luxury. Henry poured another glass of water, handing it to Samuel. You know, you've done more in one evening than most men do in a lifetime. Samuel shook his head. I only reminded them of something they already knew, but had forgotten. Henry chuckled. That's what makes you different, Samuel. You don't just talk, you live it. The city lights pulsed in the distance, silent witnesses to the man who had turned humiliation into a lesson. Samuel removed his hat, set it on the table, and leaned back, his eyes closing. But even in rest, his presence filled the room, a reminder that true power does not need to shout. In the lobby below, Michael drifted into uneasy sleep, his future uncertain, his pride stripped away, but his hope fragile and alive. Carly walked the marble floors once more, her head high, her heart steady, her resolve unshakable. And Samuel Hart, rancher, owner, leader, closed his eyes to the city's glow, ready for tomorrow's storm, calm as ever. Samuel Hart, 55, rancher, calm but commanding, plaid shirt beneath a clean jacket, hat in hand, eyes sharp with resolve. Michael Graves, 42, humbled, quieter, stripped of arrogance, a man on the edge of transformation. Carly, 24, interim manager, now confident professional stance, learning to carry authority. Dr. Henry Lawson, 58, distinguished businessman, voice carrying weight in every room, proud of Samuel Marcos Alvarez. 40, auction representative, focused, sharp, always aware of the millions at stake. Auction house, Chicago Convention Center, grand hall with banners, glass lights, a crowd of investors, ranchers and journalists, atmosphere of tension and money. Morning broke over Chicago, the skyline bathed in gold as the city stirred to life. He rose early, his routine unchanged from the ranch, his body moving with the rhythm of a man who had never abandoned discipline. In the suite, his suitcase was already packed neatly, documents ready, his hat waiting like a crown on the table. Henry Lawson knocked lightly before entering, already in his Italian suit, his eyes sharp with anticipation. "Auction day," Henry said with a grin. "Time to show this city what Texas is made of." Samuel smiled faintly. "Not show, Henry, just prove." Marcos Alvarez arrived moments later, his portfolio under his arm, his tone brisk. "Gentlemen, we need to move. The floor will be hot today." The three men left the suite, their steps measured, their presence commanding, and when the elevator opened, the lobby froze again. Guests who had witnessed last night's storm now straightened, whispering Samuel's name like an incantation. Carly stood behind the desk, her uniform crisp, her voice steady. "Good morning, Mr. Hart. Best of luck today." Samuel tipped his hat, his eyes warm. "Luck favors the prepared, Carly," her cheeks flushed with pride, her shoulders squared. She was no longer just an employee, she was part of a legacy. Michael watched from a distance, his posture smaller than ever, but his eyes carrying the glimmer of humility he had never known before. Samuel's gaze met his briefly, no word spoken, but a silent reminder passed between them. Redemption was earned in work, not in speeches. Outside, black cars lined the curb, the kind that ferried men with millions in their pockets and ambition in their veins. The convention center loomed ahead, banners of livestock champions and proud ranches hanging like war flags in a coliseum. Inside, the air buzzed with tension, the crowd a mix of ranchers in boots and investors in suits, each one here to gamble on bloodlines and legacy. The auction floor was lit like a stage, a spotlight ready to follow every animal that would step through the gate. Cameras clicked, journalists whispered, money flowed invisibly through the room before a single bid had been made. Samuel entered quietly, but heads turned, whispers spread, and a ripple of respect passed like a wave across the hall. Some men nodded, others whispered his name. All recognized the presence of a man who had already shaped the market. Marcos led him to the front, a row reserved for buyers whose bids could tilt the entire auction. Henry sat beside him, his posture upright, his eyes scanning the crowd with the calm of a man who had stood in boardrooms around the world. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the hall, sharp and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Chicago Elite Livestock Auction." Applause followed, polite but heavy, with the knowledge that fortunes would be won and lost in this very room. The first lot entered, a sleek bull, its muscles rippling, its frame carrying the weight of generations of breeding. Bids began immediately, numbers flying, hands rising, the auctioneer's voice quickening like a drumbeat. Samuel sat still, silent, his eyes analyzing, his breath even, his presence unshaken. The bull sold for 700,000, a record for its line, but Samuel's hand never lifted. "You're waiting," Henry whispered. "You see something bigger." Samuel nodded once, his gaze unbroken. Patience always wins more than impulse. The next lots rolled, cows and bulls, bids climbing into hundreds of thousands, applause breaking with every sale. But Samuel waited, silent, still, as though the real game had not yet begun. Then the spotlight shifted, and the announcer's voice deepened. Lot number 7, the son of Titan, grandsire champion, lineage unbroken. The bull stepped forward, larger than life, its frame solid, its eyes burning with calm fire. The crowd inhaled sharply, murmurs spreading instantly. Everyone knew this was no ordinary lot. "Starting at 1 million, the auctioneer called, his voice snapping like a whip. "Do I hear 1 million? A hand shot up instantly, then another, the numbers climbing like wildfire. 1.2, 1.5, 1.7, the room electric with hunger for possession. Samuel remained silent, his hat resting on his knee. 2 million, shouted a man in a dark suit, his voice filled with triumph. Applause rippled, but Samuel still sat still, his hand unmoving, his breath steady. 2.2, another bidder called, sweat forming on his brow, desperation creeping in. The bull stamped once, its power undeniable, its presence filling the hall with an authority almost human. 2.5, the auctioneer barked. 2.5 million. Samuel's hand lifted, calm, steady, not a gesture but a command. 3 million, he said, his voice carrying across the hall, silencing whispers, stopping breath. The auctioneer slammed the gavel once in recognition. 3 million from Mr. Hart. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some gasping, others nodding, the air alive with shock and respect. The other bidders hesitated, their bravado cracking, their wallets trembling against Samuel's unshaken calm. 3.1, one man tried, his voice weaker now. Samuel's hand rose again, his voice firm. 3.5. Gasps filled the hall, the weight of the number pressing against every wall, every chest, every mind. The opposing bidder sat down slowly, defeated, his pride dissolving under the calm certainty of Samuel Hart. The auctioneer's voice thundered, 3.5 million going once, twice, sold to Mr. Hart. Applause erupted, thunderous, unstoppable, the kind reserved for champions and legends. Samuel lowered his hand, his face calm, his eyes steady, as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Marcos exhaled, shaking his head. "You just made history again, Mr. Hart." Henry chuckled, his voice warm, and without breaking a sweat. "It's not history," Samuel said softly. "It's investment. It's responsibility." The next lots came, the rhythm of bidding resuming, but the room remained under the spell of what they had just seen. Samuel continued, not always the highest bidder, but always precise, his presence shaping the auction itself. By midday, the numbers on his ledger stretched into tens of millions, but his calm never cracked, his hand never shook. To him, money was a tool, not a crown, respect the only true wealth. When the final gavel fell, Samuel had secured the animals he sought, bloodlines that would shape generations, investments that would ripple across nations. The press swarmed instantly, microphones, cameras, lights, their voices crashing like waves. "Mr. Hart, 3.5 million. What does this mean for the market?" Samuel adjusted his hat, his calm smile steady. "It means the future is built on respect, in animals, in people, in everything we touch." The words spread instantly, carried by headlines, repeated by voices, amplified beyond the walls of the convention center. In the back, Michael stood quietly, watching the man he had once mocked, his chest tightening with shame and with newfound resolve. Carly stood beside him, her arms crossed, her voice low. "You see now, respect isn't a trick, it's power." Michael nodded slowly. "I see it, and I'll never forget it." Samuel left the stage, Henry and Marcos flanking him, the crowd parting like water for a ship too great to stop. Outside the sunlight was bright, the air sharp, the city alive with noise, but around Samuel there was calm. Journalists shouted, cameras flashed, but his stride was steady, unhurried, unshaken. Henry leaned close. "You know, you didn't just win bids today, you won hearts." "Hearts matter more than bids," Samuel replied. "Bids can be matched, hearts cannot." Marcos grinned. The market won't forget what happened in there. Samuel's eyes narrowed against the sunlight. Markets forget, but people remember. Back at the hotel, Carly gathered the staff, her voice steady, her authority undeniable. You all saw what happened yesterday, and today proves it. This hotel belongs to a man who treats everyone with dignity, and we will do the same. No exceptions. The staff nodded, some proudly, others with guilt, but all with resolve. Michael listened from the corner, silent, humbled, the words cutting deeper than any reprimand. Carly turned to him, her voice softer. Your chance starts now, Michael. Don't waste it. He nodded, his voice low but true. I won't. Not this time. Upstairs, Samuel set his suitcase on the suite table once more, his hat beside it, his hands resting calmly. Henry raised a glass of water. To respect, Samuel, the only wealth that never fades. Samuel lifted his own, the city glittering beyond the window, and as the night fell over Chicago, the story of the rancher in the cowboy hat spread far beyond the city, a story not of wealth, but of dignity, humility, and the quiet strength of respect. Samuel Hart, 55, rancher, plaid shirt, hat in hand, calm but commanding presence, eyes that cut through arrogance. Michael Graves, 42, working the ranch, humbled, calloused hands, learning redemption through sweat. Carly, 24, hotel manager, professional, calm, eyes filled with confidence, guiding her team with Samuel's lesson in mind. Dr. Henry Lawson, 58, respected businessman, loyal friend, still amused and proud of Samuel's choices. Marcos Alvarez, 40, auction professional, voice steady, remembering Chicago as a turning point for the industry. Heartland Ranch, Texas, wide fields under golden light, cattle grazing, silence of the land, teaching lessons stronger than words. Months passed, but the memory of that night in Chicago lingered like the echo of thunder after a storm. The Grand Regent Hotel changed forever, its marble halls no longer filled with whispered judgments, but with quiet respect. Guests arrived with their suits and gowns, but the staff welcomed them the same as travelers in boots and denim. Carly stood behind the desk each day, with authority she had once thought impossible for her. Her voice carried steady, her orders firm, her kindness unshaken, and the team followed her example. Samuel's policy, spoken in a single sentence, had become the law of the hotel. Respect costs nothing, but it builds everything. Guests left reviews, not of chandeliers or velvet carpets, but of the way they had been treated as equals. The Grand Regent's reputation soared, not just for luxury, but for humanity. And in boardrooms across the city, Samuel's story was told like a legend, whispered by those who had witnessed it firsthand. Michael's name was no longer spoken in those halls, but far away in Texas, his story was just beginning. At Heartland Ranch, he woke before dawn, his city hands blistering from ropes, his body aching from work he had never known. The arrogance that once filled his voice had been burned away by sun, sweat, and silence. Under Samuel's foreman, old men who spoke little but worked much, Michael learned humility, one task at a time. Fence first, they told him, and he built fences. Feed second, they told him, and he carried feed. Respect last, they told him, and slowly he understood what that meant. Respect not demanded but earned through sweat and through service. Some nights he sat alone in the bunkhouse, staring at the calluses on his hands, realizing they were marks of a man reborn. Letters from Chicago reached him sometimes, not from Samuel, but from Carly. She wrote of the hotel, of the lessons, of the guests who asked about Samuel's words. Michael read them slowly, each line a reminder that dignity had been given to him when he least deserved it. And in the silence of the Texas plains, he promised never to forget it. Back in Chicago, Carly grew into her role, her posture taller, her voice steadier, her decisions sharper. Staff who once feared the arrogance of managers now trusted her fairness. Guests who once judged others by their boots now caught themselves before speaking. The hotel did not lose its wealth, its glamour, or its prestige, but it gained something richer than all three combined: soul. Samuel rarely returned, but when he did, he walked through the lobby unnoticed at first, a quiet man in boots, and Carly always greeted him with the same warmth. "Welcome back, Mr. Hart." He would smile softly, tip his hat and say, "You're running it better than I ever could," because leadership was not control, it was trust, and Carly had proven worthy of it. Dr. Henry Lawson continued to tell the story at dinners, in boardrooms, at auctions. "I saw a manager break and a cowboy rise," he would say with a grin, "and I learned that wealth wears many faces." His words carried weight, not because of the man he was, but because of the man he spoke of. Marcos Alvarez remembered that auction too, the moment Samuel lifted his hand and silenced the room. "3.5 million, he would say, and he never blinked, because it wasn't about money, it was about respect. Other ranchers listened, other investors nodded, and the market itself shifted, reminded that values could be stronger than numbers. Samuel stayed where he belonged, at Heartland Ranch, among cattle and land, among silence and sky. He rose with the sun, not to chase wealth, but to honor the rhythm of work. His cattle thrived, his ranch expanded, but his heart remained steady, untouched by the noise of cities. Men came to learn from him, students, ranchers, businessmen. They came expecting secrets, formulas, shortcuts. But Samuel only repeated the same truth: respect costs nothing, but it builds everything. And when they left, they carried the lesson heavier than gold. One evening, Samuel walked the fields alone, the horizon painted orange with sunset. He stopped by the fence, his hand resting on the wood, his eyes tracing the cattle moving slowly across the pasture. The silence was deep, but not empty, filled with the weight of memory and the peace of humility. He thought of Chicago, of the marble lobby, of the crowd that had doubted him. He thought of Carly's steady eyes, of Michael's broken voice, of Henry's loyal laughter. He thought of the millions spent, not as trophies, but as investments in the future of the herd. And he smiled, because money had never been his crown, respect was. Behind him, the ranch lights flickered on, warm against the darkening sky. Voices carried from the bunkhouse, laughter, songs, the sound of men who worked with pride. Samuel tipped his hat to the horizon, a silent prayer of thanks to the land that had given him everything. Not wealth, not titles, but truth. In Chicago, Carly closed the books for the night, her desk orderly, her mind calm. She looked at the framed note Samuel had left for her. The handwriting simple, the message eternal. Respect costs nothing, but it builds everything. She read it every night before locking her office, not as a rule, but as a reminder, because a hotel without respect was just stone and glass. With respect, it was a home for all. In Texas, Michael ended another long day, his shirt soaked with sweat, his muscles burning with exhaustion. He sat on the porch of the bunkhouse, staring at the stars that stretched wider than any skyscraper. His hands ached, his pride gone, but his heart was lighter than it had ever been. He whispered softly to no one and everyone, "Thank you, Mr. Hart, for not giving up on me." In the silence of the plains, the words seemed to carry, lifted by wind, heard by land, acknowledged by sky. Redemption was never easy, but it was possible, and Michael Graves was learning it one day at a time. Samuel never asked for reports from him, never checked on his progress. He trusted the land to teach what no man could lecture, and the land never failed. At the next Chicago auction, Samuel appeared again, his presence quiet but commanding. The crowd whispered before he even spoke, their respect already given. The auctioneer paused to acknowledge him, the weight of his presence undeniable. And when Samuel lifted his hand again, the room stilled, as though remembering the lesson he carried. 3 million, he said calmly, his voice steady as stone, and no one dared laugh this time. because no one doubted anymore. They had seen, they had learned, they had remembered. Respect had become currency, and Samuel Hart was its wealthiest bearer. Back at Heartland Ranch, the sun rose again. Another day, another test, another chance to work with dignity. The cattle grazed, the fields stretched, the wind whispered through the grass. Samuel rode slowly on horseback, his hat shading his calm eyes, his posture upright, his heart steady. He passed Michael repairing a fence, and the man raised a hand, sweat dripping, pride absent, humility present. Samuel nodded back, no words needed, the gesture enough, the respect mutual. Carly visited once, standing in the fields with awe, realizing that marble and glass could never teach what open sky could. She watched Samuel with the cattle, the way he moved with patience, the way animals responded to calm authority. "Now I understand," she whispered. "Respect is not taught, it is lived." And Samuel Hart, the rancher who had walked into a marble hotel and silenced it with humility, kept walking, kept working, kept living the lesson, because true wealth was never the millions he spent, but the lives he changed, one act of respect at a time.